The sun was just beginning to set outside the large glass windows of the principal's office, casting long, orange shadows across the room. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. Principal Richard Vance sat in his high-backed leather chair, his fingers steepled together as he stared intently at the file spread out on his desk. It was a thick file, which was surprising considering it belonged to a 7-year-old boy. Richard wasn't a cruel man. He didn't enjoy punishing children, nor did he like making parents feel small. However, he took his job very seriously. He believed in order, in standards, and in the importance of data. To him, numbers didn't lie. If a child was smart, the grades showed it. If a child was struggling, the grades showed that too. Right now, the numbers on the paper in front of him were telling a very clear story, and it was a story that Richard had seen too many times before. It was the story of a child who just didn't fit the mold. The boy's name was Toby. To his teachers, Toby was a puzzle that couldn't be solved. He wasn't a bad kid. He didn't hit other students, and he didn't steal lunch money. But he was difficult. He was the kind of difficult that wore a teacher down. When the rest of the class was learning their multiplication tables, Toby would be staring at a dust mote floating in a beam of light, completely lost in his own world. When it was time for silent reading, Toby would be under his desk, arranging his crayons in a specific, complicated pattern. When asked a question, he would often just blink, taking so long to answer that the teacher would eventually move on to someone else. Richard let out a heavy sigh and rubbed his temples. He had a meeting in 5 minutes with Toby's mother. He had already made up his mind about what needed to be done, but he knew actually saying the words out loud was going to be hard. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the playground below. The swings were empty now, swaying gently in the breeze. He remembered being a child once, feeling the pressure to perform, to be the best. He didn't want Toby to feel that pressure, but he also couldn't let the boy drift through school learning nothing. That would be a disservice to him. There was a soft knock on the metal frame of his open door. Richard turned to see his secretary standing there. "Mrs. Gable is here for her appointment, Mr. Vance," she said quietly. "Show her in, please," Richard replied, straightening his tie and walking back to his desk. A moment later, Mrs. Gable walked into the office. She was a woman who looked tired in the way that only parents of struggling children can look. She wore a simple beige coat that had seen better days and carried a large, worn purse. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she gripped the strap of her purse so tightly that her knuckles were white. She looked around the office nervously, as if she were walking into a courtroom rather than a school office. "Mrs. Gable, thank you for coming in," Richard said, forcing a warm, professional smile. He gestured to the plastic chair on the other side of his desk. "Please, have a seat." "Thank you, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She sat down on the very edge of the chair, her back straight, ready for whatever bad news was coming her way. Richard sat down as well and folded his hands on top of Toby's file. He looked at Mrs. Gable for a moment, trying to find the gentlest way to begin. He didn't want to hurt her, but he had to be honest. The school had standards to uphold. "We asked you to come in today because we are concerned about Toby's progress," Richard began slowly. "As you know, we are halfway through the term, and we have been tracking his performance very closely." Mrs. Gable nodded quickly. "I know. He tries. I promise you, he tries very hard at home." "I believe he does," Richard said, trying to sound reassuring. But effort doesn't always equal results in a structured environment. Mrs. Gable, Toby is significantly behind his peers. In math, he is failing to grasp even the basic concepts. In reading, he struggles to recognize words that the other children mastered months ago. And his focus. Richard paused, tapping the paper. His teachers report that he is rarely mentally present in the classroom. Mrs. Gable looked down at her hands. She picked at a loose thread on her coat. He sees things differently, Mr. Vance. He notices things that other people don't. If you just let him explain. Richard interrupted her gently but firmly. We have tried letting him explain. We have tried patience, we have tried extra tutoring, and we have tried moving his seat closer to the front. But the curriculum is moving fast, and Toby is falling further and further behind. He is becoming frustrated, and it is affecting the other students. He watched her shoulders slump forward. It was heartbreaking to watch, really. He knew she loved her son. Every parent does. But love couldn't teach a child to read or do calculus. Sometimes, love blinded parents to the hard truth. Mrs. Gable took a shaky breath. So, what does this mean? Are you going to expel him? Oh no, no, Richard said quickly, shaking his head. Expulsion is for children who break the rules. Toby isn't breaking rules, he just has different needs. We have a program here at the school. It's a specialized learning track. The classes are smaller. The pace is slower. It focuses on life skills and practical learning rather than advanced academics. Mrs. Gable's head snapped up. Her eyes widened in alarm. You mean, the special education class down the hall in the basement? It's not the basement, Mrs. Gable, it's the first floor, Richard corrected her. And yes, that is the program. We feel that Toby would be much more successful there. He wouldn't feel the constant pressure to keep up with a curriculum that is too hard for him. He could learn at his own speed. But he is smart, Mrs. Gable insisted, her voice trembling slightly. I hear him talking at home. He remembers everything. He remembers conversations I had 3 years ago. He knows how things work. You put him in that class, and you're telling him he is stupid. You're telling him he can't do it. Richard leaned forward, his voice dropping to a soft, reasonable tone. We aren't saying he is stupid. We are saying he learns differently. Putting him in a class where he can succeed is the kindest thing we can do. If we leave him in the regular class, he is just going to continue to fail. He will get older, and the gap will get wider, and he will feel like a failure every single day. Is that what you want for him? The question hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp. It was the logic that Richard used in these meetings. It was the logic that usually worked. It was hard for a parent to argue against protecting their child from feeling like a failure. Mrs. Gable didn't answer immediately. She looked past Richard, out the window where the sun had finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep, bruised purple. She seemed to be fighting a battle inside her own mind. She knew Toby was struggling. She saw the homework he brought home that he couldn't do. She saw the sad look in his eyes when he got off the bus. But she also saw the spark in him when he was engaged, the way he could listen to a song once and play it on his toy piano, or how he could tell you exactly how a car engine worked just by listening to it hum. She looked back at Richard, her eyes filled with a desperate kind of hope. Please, she whispered. Don't send him there yet. Give me 2 weeks. Just 2 weeks. Richard frowned slightly. Mrs. Gable, the paperwork is already drafted. Moving him now is the logical step. Just 2 weeks, she repeated, leaning forward. I will work with him every night. I will talk to his teachers. Just, let him try a little longer. If he hasn't improved by the end of the month, I will sign whatever papers you want. I won't fight you. But please, don't give up on him today. Richard looked at the woman. He saw the tears welling in the corners of her eyes, threatening to spill over. He saw the way she pleaded, not with anger, but with pure love for her child. He was a man of logic and rules, but he was also a human being. He knew that sometimes, Data didn't tell the whole story. Or maybe, he just didn't want to be the one to crush this woman's spirit today. He sighed again, a long, tired sound, and closed the file folder. He pushed it to the side of his desk. Okay, Richard said slowly. Okay. 2 weeks. Mrs. Gable let out a breath that sounded like a sob. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vance. But I have to be clear, Richard continued, his voice becoming serious again. I need to see real improvement, not just trying hard, but results. If his grades don't go up, and if his teachers don't see a change in his focus, we will move forward with the transfer. No more delays. Do we have a deal? Mrs. Gable nodded vigorously. Yes. Yes, deal. You won't regret this. Toby is going to show you. She stood up, smoothing her coat, looking lighter than she had when she walked in. She thanked him one more time and turned to leave. As she walked out the doorway, Richard watched her go. He hoped, for her sake and for Toby's, that the boy could pull a miracle out of his hat. But looking at the numbers in his mind, Richard prepared himself for the inevitable. He grabbed a pen from his desk holder and made a small note on his calendar for 2 weeks from now. Meeting, Toby Gable Review. He clicked the pen closed with a sharp snap. The office was quiet again, save for the hum of the computer monitor. Richard looked back out the window. The street lights had flickered on below. He wondered if he had just given the boy a fighting chance, or if he had just prolonged the suffering. He shook his head, clearing the thought away. There was work to do. He opened the next file on his stack and began to read. The 2 weeks Mrs. Gable had bargained for did not start with a bang, but rather with a quiet, determined hum. For Toby, the world outside the principal's office didn't suddenly change because his mother had made a deal. The school building still smelled the same, the lights still buzzed overhead with that annoying flicker, and the other kids still moved in packs that seemed to have invisible rules Toby didn't understand. But inside his small apartment, everything was different. Mrs. Gable was not a teacher. She worked long hours at a local diner, standing on her feet for hours, serving coffee and plates of fries to people who barely looked at her. But when she came home, she didn't collapse on the couch like she used to. She took off her coat, washed her face, and sat at the chipped kitchen table with Toby. She didn't yell, and she didn't force him to stare at textbooks that made his eyes glaze over. Instead, she tried to find a way into his world. Toby, she said one evening, placing a bowl of soup in front of him. Mr. Vance thinks you can't do the work. He thinks you aren't smart enough for the big class. Toby didn't look up. He was busy tracing the pattern of the tablecloth with his finger. He heard smart enough and it felt like a stone in his stomach. He knew he was different. He knew he was slow at writing his letters. His hand hurt when he tried to hold the pencil the way the teacher showed him. It felt like trying to catch a fish with bare hands, slippery and impossible. But I know you are smart, she continued, reaching over to stop his hand. You just have a busy brain. We need to find the switch to turn on the right light. So, the nights became a series of experiments. They tried singing the multiplication tables. Mrs. Gable had a terrible voice, but she would clap her hands and sing 7 times 7 is 49 until Toby giggled. They tried drawing the history lessons instead of reading them. Toby drew amazing pictures, battlefields with tiny soldiers, maps with winding rivers, but when it came time to write a sentence about what happened, he would freeze. The letters just wouldn't come together. The pictures in his head were movies, full of color and sound, but the paper wanted black and white, and it wanted silence. Back at school, the pressure was beginning to mount. Ms. Harmon, his teacher, was a kind woman, but she was tired. She had 30 other children in the room, and the state exams were coming up. She wanted Toby to succeed, really she did, but she had a curriculum to follow. Every day, there was a new checklist. Every day, Toby's name was on the not completed list. One Tuesday morning, just a few days before the deadline, the class was working on a science assignment. They were learning about the water cycle: evaporation, condensation, precipitation. It was a fancy set of words for how rain worked. Ms. Harmon had drawn a diagram on the whiteboard. She used blue markers and arrows. She asked the class to copy the diagram into their notebooks and write 3 sentences explaining it. The room filled with the scratching sound of pencils on paper and the shifting of chairs. Toby stared at his blank page. He looked at the whiteboard. He knew how rain worked. He could see the steam rising from his hot bath at home. He could see the clouds heavy and gray before a storm. He could feel the wet pavement. He understood it perfectly. But when he looked down at his paper, the word evaporation looked like a tangled pile of sticks. He didn't know where to start. He tapped his pencil. Tap, tap, tap. He looked out the window. A bird was hopping on the sill. Toby, please focus, Ms. Harmon said softly as she walked past his desk. He jumped. He gripped the pencil tighter and tried to force the letters out. He made an E. It looked like a backwards 3. He erased it. The paper tore slightly. He felt the hot prick of tears in his eyes. He didn't want to go to the basement class. He didn't want his mom to be sad. He wanted to be good, but his hand wouldn't listen to his brain. Meanwhile, Principal Vance was watching. He stood in the hallway, looking through the small rectangular window in the classroom door. He watched Toby struggling. He saw the boy erase the same spot on his paper over and over again until the hole was too big to ignore. Vance checked his watch. Then he looked at the clipboard in his hand. He had a graph there. It was a line that was going down. Vance felt a pang of something, maybe disappointment, maybe just the weight of being right. He didn't want to be right about Toby failing. He wanted the boy to prove him wrong. But Vance believed in reality. And reality was that Toby was drowning in a regular classroom. Keeping him there wasn't helping, it was just prolonging the struggle. Vance turned away from the door and walked back toward his office, his shoes clicking sharply on the tiled floor. He mentally prepared the transfer papers. He told himself he was doing the right thing, the compassionate thing. By the time Friday arrived, the atmosphere in the Gable house was thick with anxiety. Toby sat on the rug, playing with his toy cars. He was lining them up in a perfect straight line, smallest to largest. He was focused, calm. He knew how to do this. He understood the order of things. Mrs. Gable sat on the sofa, watching him. She saw the intelligence in the way he categorized the cars. He noticed details she missed: a scratch on a fender, a missing hubcap. He noticed everything. "Toby," she called out gently. "Tomorrow is the assembly. Mr. Vance will be watching." Toby stopped playing. He didn't turn around. "I know," he whispered. "Do you want to practice the reading again?" she asked. "No," Toby said, his voice small. "The letters dance, Mom. They move too much." Mrs. Gable closed her eyes. She wanted to cry, but she couldn't. If she cried, he would think it was hopeless. She stood up and walked over to him, sitting on the floor beside him. She picked up a red car and rolled it back and forth. "It's okay if the letters dance," she said. "Maybe you don't need to read them. Maybe you just need to speak." She had been thinking about this all week. Every time she tried to get Toby to write, he failed. But when he was just playing, when he was relaxed, he would tell her stories. He would do impressions of the people he saw. He would mimic the bus driver's deep good morning. Or the high-pitched laugh of the lady at the grocery store. He could capture a person's soul just by changing the tone of his voice. It was a gift, a strange and hidden gift, but it was real. "Mr. Vance listens with his ears," she told Toby, tapping her ear. "He doesn't just read papers. You have 2 weeks to show him you belong. Don't show him the writing. Show him what you can hear." Toby looked at her, his eyes wide. "Show him." "Yes," she smiled, brushing the hair off his forehead. "Just, show him who you really are." The next morning, the school was buzzing with energy. It was the last day of the probation period. It was also the day of the community share, a monthly tradition where the whole school gathered in the auditorium. Usually, it was a boring affair. The principal gave a speech about attendance, a few kids played the recorder off-key, and everyone sat on hard, folding benches wishing they were in class. But today, the air felt different. Toby walked into his classroom. He didn't have his backpack. He wasn't wearing his usual hooded sweatshirt. His mother had made him wear a nice button-down shirt that felt a bit stiff around the neck. He felt weird. He felt exposed. Ms. Harmon looked at him, surprised. "Toby, where is your homework, the final packet?" Toby looked at his feet. "I didn't do it." The teacher sighed, a long, sad sound. She walked over and put a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, Toby. We tried our best." She thought he had given up. She thought he was just accepting his fate. But when Toby looked up, he didn't look defeated. He looked focused. He looked like he was listening to something far away. "Ms. Harmon," he asked, "can I sign up for the open mic?" The teacher blinked. "The open mic, Toby, usually students practice for weeks. What would you do?" "I just want to talk," Toby said. "Just for a minute." Ms. Harmon looked at the clock. The assembly was in an hour. The principal was expecting the transfer paperwork on his desk by the end of the day. She looked at Toby's face, so serious and intense. She couldn't say no to him. Not today. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll put your name on the list." Down the hall, in his office, Principal Vance was tidying his desk. He put the transfer form into a crisp manila folder. He felt a heavy sense of resignation, but also a sense of order. Things were being corrected. The system was working. He picked up his glasses and headed for the auditorium. He expected to sit in the back, nod politely at the bad recorder playing, and then go back to his office to make a difficult phone call. He didn't know that the system was about to be interrupted in a way no spreadsheet could ever predict. He walked out of his office, turning the lock on the handle. The hallway was empty, echoing with his footsteps. The stage was set. The lights were ready. And Toby was waiting in the wings, preparing to show the world that he wasn't a problem to be solved, but a voice waiting to be heard. The school auditorium was a large box of a room with high ceilings and floors that had been polished so many times they shone like mirrors. As the students filed in, the air filled with the scent of floor wax and the sound of 300 children shuffling their feet. It was a chaotic noise, a mix of whispers, laughs, and the screech of chairs dragging across the floor. At the front of the room, a heavy red curtain hung behind the stage, framing the space where the teachers usually sat. Principal Richard Vance walked down the center aisle, nodding politely at a few teachers. He carried his clipboard under his arm like a shield. He found his usual spot in the very back row, a metal chair that had been reserved for him. From here, he could see everything. He could see the back of Toby's head, 3 rows from the front. The boy sat perfectly still, his small shoulders tense. He was wearing that stiff button-down shirt, looking uncomfortable. Vance sighed. He felt a knot of tension in his own chest. He hated being the bad guy. He hated that in just 1 hour, he would likely have to tell that mother that her son had failed the simplest of tasks, paying attention and doing the work. He looked down at his clipboard one last time. The transfer papers were clipped to the back, ready to be processed. He told himself he was doing the right thing. He was protecting Toby from the frustration of constant failure. "Welcome, everyone," the vice principal's voice boomed over the crackling speaker system. The chatter died down slowly. "Welcome to our monthly community share." The assembly began just as every other assembly did. The third graders sang a song about geography, with half the class singing off-key. A girl from the 6th grade played a violin piece that was technically impressive but very long. Richard watched the clock on the wall. The second hand ticked loudly in his head. Tick, tock. Tick, tock. He watched the students. Most were fidgeting. Some were passing notes. A few were staring blankly at the ceiling. Then, Ms. Harmon stood up and walked to the microphone stand. The hum of the room shifted. Ms. Harmon was Toby's teacher. She looked nervous. She smoothed her skirt and adjusted the microphone height. We have a special treat today," she said, her voice echoing slightly. Usually, students sign up weeks in advance. But today, a student asked to speak. He has something he wants to share with the school. A ripple of whispers went through the rows of children. Richard sat up straighter. He saw Ms. Harmon look toward Toby. The boy didn't move at first. Then, slowly, he stood up. Richard felt a sudden spike of alarm. What was Toby doing? This wasn't part of the deal. The deal was to do his work. Toby was notoriously shy. He hated speaking in front of the class. Why would he want to speak in front of the whole school? Richard thought about standing up and stopping it, but he was too far back. And besides, maybe this was Toby's way of trying. Maybe he was going to give a speech about how he would try harder. Richard leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, watching intently. Toby walked up the side steps of the stage. The spotlight from the ceiling hit him, making his pale skin look almost translucent. He looked impossibly small up there. He walked to the center of the stage and stood in front of the microphone. It was set too high for him. He reached up and, without saying a word, pulled the microphone down until it was level with his chin. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The auditorium was completely silent. It was that rare, heavy silence that only happens when a crowd realizes something unexpected is happening. The silence stretched out, long and uncomfortable. Kids looked at each other, confused. Teachers looked at Ms. Harmon, who stood to the side, wringing her hands. Then, Toby opened his mouth. "Now class," Toby said. But it wasn't Toby's voice. The voice that came out of the small boy was deeper, raspier, and sounded tired. It was the exact, perfect voice of Mr. Vance himself. The students in the front row gasped. A few teachers turned their heads sharply toward the back of the room to look at the principal. "Now class," Toby continued, imitating the principal's stern, lecture-style tone. "Open your books to page 40. No talking. We do not have time for daydreaming. The data shows we are behind." Richard froze in his chair. His mouth fell open slightly. He was listening to himself. But it wasn't just the words. It was the rhythm. It was the way he paused after data shows. It was the slight sigh before he said behind. It was unnerving. It was like watching a mirror. Toby didn't stop. He shifted his weight. Instantly, his posture changed. He slumped his shoulders to one side and stuck his hip out. His voice changed again, this time to a high, sharp pitch. "Excuse me, are those snacks in your bag?" Toby said. It was the voice of Mrs. Baker, the strict lunch lady who patrolled the cafeteria. "You know the rules. No outside food. Hand it over." The silence in the auditorium broke. A wave of laughter swept through the students. It started as giggles and then grew into loud, genuine laughter. It wasn't mean laughter, it was the laughter of recognition. They all knew Mrs. Baker. They all knew that exact tone. But Toby wasn't done. He closed his eyes again, transforming before their eyes. He stopped moving entirely. He stood very straight, his hands clutching his own shirt. When he spoke again, his voice trembled. It was soft, high, and sounded like it was holding back tears. "I just want him to be okay," Toby whispered into the microphone. "I just want him to have a chance. Please, don't give up on him." The laughter died instantly. The room went quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. It was a heavy, awestruck silence. Every single adult in the room knew exactly who he was imitating. He was imitating his mother. He was repeating, word for word and tone for tone, what she had said in the principal's office just 2 weeks ago. Principal Vance stood up. He couldn't help it. He gripped the back of the chair in front of him so hard his knuckles turned white. He stared at the stage. He remembered that moment in his office. He remembered Mrs. Gable's trembling hands. He remembered the exact way her voice broke when she said don't give up on him. Toby was doing it all. He was doing the vice principal's morning announcements. He was doing the gym teacher's whistle commands. He was doing the sound of the heavy school bus brakes screeching, just using his voice and a sharp intake of breath. It wasn't just a mimicry. It wasn't a party trick. As Richard watched, he realized something profound. Toby was processing the world. He wasn't ignoring the lessons or the people around him. He was absorbing everything. He was recording every sound, every emotion, every pause in a conversation, and storing it away. The boy who couldn't write a sentence about a rain cloud had just recreated the entire emotional landscape of the school in 5 minutes. Richard felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the clipboard in his hand. He looked at the transfer papers. They seemed so ridiculous now. They were just paper with ink on them. They measured how fast a child could write numbers. They didn't measure how well a child could listen. They didn't measure how deeply a child could feel. The boy on the stage stopped. He stood there for a moment, just breathing. The spotlight seemed to glow around him. He looked out at the hundreds of faces, but he didn't look at them all at once. He looked right past the crowd, right toward the very back of the room. Toby opened his eyes. For the first time in his life at this school, he looked focused. He looked confident. He looked directly at Principal Vance. "And now," Toby said, his voice returning to his own natural, soft tone, speaking clearly into the mic, "I have a math problem to solve." He didn't wait for applause. He simply stepped back from the microphone, turned on his heel, and walked off the stage. He walked past the stunned Miss Harmon and down the stairs. He walked back to his seat, sat down, and fixed his shirt collar. For a second, the auditorium was dead silent. Then, a slow clap started from the back. Then another. Then, the whole room erupted. It wasn't the polite applause they gave the violin player. It was a roar. Students stomped their feet on the floor. Teachers stood up. The noise was deafening. Richard stood still in the back row. The noise washed over him, but he didn't move. He was paralyzed by the realization of his own blindness. He had looked at a quiet, struggling boy and seen a deficit. He had seen a failure. But he had been wrong. He had been completely and totally wrong. He took a deep breath, the noise of the applause filling his ears. He looked down at his hand and unclenched it from the back of the chair. He looked at the transfer papers one last time. He reached down, tore them off the clipboard, and folded them up. He put them in his pocket, away from sight. He had seen the numbers. He had seen the blank test papers. But today, without writing a single word, Toby had passed the most important test of all. He had been heard. And now, Principal Richard Vance had a very different kind of work to do. He had to find a way to apologize, and more importantly, he had to find a way to keep a promise he hadn't even made yet. He had to help this boy stay. The sound in the auditorium was like a physical force, a wall of noise that bounced off the high ceiling and rattled the windows. 500 people were on their feet, clapping, cheering, and whistling. It was the kind of reaction usually reserved for the winning touchdown at a high school football game, not for a small boy standing on a wooden stage. But Toby didn't look like a football hero. He looked like a terrified child who had just realized exactly how many people were staring at him. He had walked off the stage quickly, his sneakers squeaking on the floor, and hurried back to his spot on the folding bench. He slid in next to his friend, ducking his head down, trying to make himself invisible. His face was bright red, his ears burning. He pulled the collar of his stiff shirt up, trying to hide. Miss Harmon, his teacher, was standing near the side of the stage. She had been ready to run up there if he froze, but she hadn't expected this. She clapped her hands together, her eyes wet with tears. She looked across the rows of children to the back of the room. She was looking for Principal Vance. Richard was still standing, but he wasn't clapping. He was gripping the back of the metal chair in front of him so tightly that his fingers hurt. The roar of the crowd seemed distant to him, muffled like he was underwater. His heart was beating a strange, frantic rhythm. He looked down at the folded papers in his pocket. The transfer request. The plan to move Toby to the basement classroom. It felt like a heavy stone in his pocket now, burning a hole through the fabric. He felt a strange mix of emotions. There was shock, certainly. He had never seen anything like that in all his years of education. But beneath the shock was something else. It was a feeling of shame. Cold, washing shame. He looked at Toby's small, huddled figure in the third row. Richard realized with a sinking feeling that he had almost thrown this away. He had looked at the numbers on a page, the bad grades, the unfinished homework, and he had decided that was the whole truth of Toby. He had decided the boy was broken. But standing there, listening to the echo of his own voice coming from that child, Richard knew he was the one who had missed the point. He had been judging a fish by its ability to climb a tree, just like the old saying went. And he had been ready to punish the fish for not climbing. Around him, the students were buzzing with excitement. "Did you hear him do, Mr. Vance?" a boy whispered loudly. It was exactly him. And his mom. "I almost cried," another girl replied. The teachers were exchanging glances, nodding. They all knew Mrs. Gable. They knew how hard she tried. They knew how difficult Toby was in the classroom. But for the first time, they were seeing the difficulty from the other side. They were seeing that Toby wasn't checking out, he was checking in too deeply. He was absorbing the emotional sounds of the room, the feelings of the people around him, and he had nowhere to put it all. So, he had stored it up, and today, he had let it out. The vice principal eventually made his way back to the microphone, holding a hand up to quiet the crowd. It took a long time for the students to settle down. They were energized, awake, alive in a way that assemblies usually didn't make them. "Wow," the vice principal said into the mic, clearing his throat. "Thank you, Toby. That was unexpected." A few more giggles rippled through the room. "And now, please remain seated as your classes are dismissed," the vice principal finished. The usual procedure began. The classes stood up row by row and marched out of the auditorium. Richard watched Toby's class line up. Toby stood at the end of the line, his head still down, holding the strap of his backpack so tight his knuckles were white. He didn't look back. He just wanted to escape. He wanted to go back to his safe spot, his corner of the classroom where he could rearrange his crayons in peace. Richard knew he should go back to his office. He had paperwork to do. He had meetings to attend. The logical thing, the administrative thing, was to go back to his desk and process the event later. Maybe make a note in Toby's file, shows strong oral presentation skills. But his feet wouldn't move toward the exit. They moved toward the side aisle. He walked down the long, sloping floor of the auditorium, moving against the flow of traffic. Students moved out of his way, looking at him with wide eyes. He reached the main aisle just as Toby's class was walking out the wide double doors into the hallway. Ms. Harmon was at the back of the line, counting heads. She stopped when she saw Richard approaching. She looked nervous, unsure if the principal was angry about the unauthorized performance. "Mr. Vance," she said, clutching her clipboard. I didn't know he was going to do that. He just asked me if he could speak." Richard stopped in front of her. He wasn't wearing his stern face anymore. He looked tired, but his eyes were soft. "It's all right, Ms. Harmon," he said. "I'm glad he did." He looked past her, into the crowded hallway where the students were mingling by the water fountains and their cubbies. He spotted Toby. The boy was kneeling by his cubby, pretending to be very busy organizing his books, clearly trying to hide. "Is Toby's mother here?" Richard asked. "She's waiting in the main office," Ms. Harmon said. She came for the meeting about the transfer. Richard nodded slowly. Of course she did. Should I send him to the office now? Miss Harmon asked. Or should he go back to class? Richard looked at the teacher. He thought about the math test sitting on his desk that Toby had failed. He thought about the transfer papers burning a hole in his pocket. He realized that sending Toby back to class to do more of the same work that didn't fit him would be the biggest mistake of his career. No, Richard said firmly. Don't send him back to class yet. And don't send him to the office to sit in a chair. I'll go to him. Ms. Harmon looked surprised, but she nodded. Richard walked out into the hallway. The noise was chaotic and happy, kids talking about the weekend, laughing, shouting. He weaved through the crowd, dodging a runaway basketball and a group of girls skipping rope. He felt like a giant moving through a land of small people. He finally reached the row of cubbies near the second-grade classrooms. Toby was still kneeling. He had taken his shoes off and put them back on, tying the laces with intense concentration. He looked up as Richard's shadow fell over him. The boy flinched, his eyes going wide. He saw the polished shoes, the dark suit pants, the clipboard. He saw the principal. Toby froze. He thought he was in trouble. He thought he was going to be yelled at for mocking the principal, or for making a scene, or for being disruptive. His lower lip started to tremble just a little bit. Richard crouched down. It wasn't something he did often, his knees weren't what they used to be. But he needed to be on Toby's level. He needed to look the boy in the eye, not look down on him from a height. He leaned his back against the wall of lockers and stretched his legs out. Toby, Richard said. His voice wasn't the stern principal voice that Toby had mimicked so perfectly on stage. It was quiet. It was hesitant. I'm sorry, Toby whispered immediately. I didn't mean to make fun of you. I wanted to show them. Show them what? Richard asked gently. Show them that I hear, Toby said, looking down at his sneakers. I hear everything. Even the things people think they don't say. Richard felt a chill run down his arms. He thought about the impression of Mrs. Gable. The desperation in the voice. Toby had heard that. Toby had understood that. Richard realized that in all his meetings, in all his data analysis, he had never actually listened to what the silence in the room was saying. You have a special gift, Toby, Richard said. Most people, they hear words. They just hear the noise. But you hear the music inside people. You hear how they feel. That is a very rare thing. It is more important than multiplication tables. It is more important than spelling. Toby looked up slowly. He searched Richard's face, looking for the lie. But he didn't find one. Am I in trouble? Toby asked. No, Richard said, shaking his head slowly. No, you're not in trouble. In fact, I think I owe you an apology. And I think I owe your mother an apology, too. Toby's eyes widened even more. Principals didn't apologize to kids. That wasn't how the world worked. Is my mom here? Toby asked. She is, Richard said. She's waiting in my office. I was supposed to tell her that you have to move to a different class. I was supposed to tell her that you couldn't do the work. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded transfer papers. He looked at them for a second, the official seal, the typed words about learning disability and specialized placement. He looked at the boy in front of him, who had just held an entire school in the palm of his hand with nothing but his voice. Richard stood up. He took the papers and walked over to the recycling bin in the hallway. He dropped them in. They fluttered down to join the discarded juice boxes and old worksheets. "But I'm not going to tell her that," Richard said, turning back to Toby. "I'm going to tell her something different. I'm going to tell her that we were wrong about you, and I'm going to ask her to give me another chance, just like she asked me to give you one." Richard held out his hand. It wasn't a handshake for a business deal. It was an offer. "Come on, Toby," Richard said. "Let's go find your mom. I think she needs to hear this from both of us." Toby looked at the hand. It was big and rough, but it was waiting for him. Toby took a deep breath, wiped his palms on his pants, and reached out. He slipped his small hand into the principal's grip. "Together?" Toby asked. "Together," Richard said. And together, the man in the suit and the boy in the untucked shirt walked down the long hallway toward the principal's office. The bell rang for the next period, echoing loudly, but for the first time, Toby didn't cover his ears. He just held on tight and walked forward. The walk down the long hallway felt longer than it ever had before. Usually, Principal Vance walked these corridors with a purpose, his mind racing through schedules and budgets, his eyes focused on the floor ahead of him. But today, his pace was slow. He was acutely aware of the small hand holding onto his fingers. Toby's grip was firm, a little sweaty, but surprisingly strong. It was an anchor. As they passed the open doors of classrooms, the sounds of learning drifted out: the scratch of chalk, the drone of a teacher reading, the sudden burst of laughter from a group activity. Usually, these were just background noise to Richard, the hum of the machine he ran. But today, he squeezed Toby's hand gently and wondered what Toby heard. Did he hear just the words, or did he hear the tiredness in the teacher's voice? Did he hear the excitement in the students' laughter? Richard realized that while he had been listening for answers, Toby had been listening for life. They reached the end of the hallway and turned the corner toward the main office. The secretary looked up from her desk, her eyes popping open wide in surprise when she saw the principal holding hands with a student. She started to stand up, probably to warn Richard that Mrs. Gable was waiting, and looked upset, but Richard gave her a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. She sat back down, watching them with curiosity. Richard stopped in front of the heavy glass door that led to his inner office. Through the blinds, he could see Mrs. Gable. She was sitting in the plastic chair, her coat pulled tight around her, staring at her hands. She looked smaller than she had 2 weeks ago. The weight of the past 14 days, the sleepless nights, the tutoring sessions, the fear of failing her son seemed to be resting physically on her shoulders. Richard took a deep breath. He felt nervous, a feeling he hadn't experienced in this office in a very long time. He looked down at Toby. "Ready?" Richard asked softly. Toby looked up at him. The fear was gone from the boy's eyes, replaced by a quiet hope. He nodded. "I'm ready." Richard pushed the door open. Mrs. Gable jumped. She turned around, her face pale, expecting to see the principal walking in alone to deliver the final verdict. She was already bracing herself, her hands gripping her purse. But when she saw Toby walk in, holding the principal's hand, her confusion was evident. "Mr. Vance?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Toby." Richard didn't go behind his desk this time. He didn't sit in the big leather chair that separated him from the people who came into his office. He walked Toby over to the empty chair next to his mother. Then, Richard pulled the visitor's chair around and sat on it, so he was facing them both. He was on their level. He was part of the circle, not the judge sitting above them. Mrs. Gable, Richard began. He cleared his throat, his voice sounding a bit rough. I just came from the assembly. I saw what Toby did. Mrs. Gable let out a long, shaky breath. She looked at Toby, her eyes swimming with tears. She reached out and brushed a lock of hair off his forehead. I was so worried he was going to freeze up, she whispered. I didn't know what he was planning. He didn't freeze, Richard said. He shined. He stunned me. He stunned everyone. Mrs. Gable looked back at the principal, waiting for the but. She knew how schools worked. She expected him to say, it was a nice performance, but he still can't do math. But Richard didn't say that. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked Mrs. Gable right in the eyes. I made a mistake, Richard said. The words were heavy, but they were honest. When we met 2 weeks ago, I told you that Toby was falling behind. I told you that the data showed he wasn't learning. I was looking at his test scores and his worksheets. I was looking at a checklist that said he couldn't keep up. He paused, glancing at Toby, who was swinging his legs slightly under the chair. I was wrong, Richard continued. Toby wasn't failing to learn. He was just learning in a way that my tests couldn't measure. Today, listening to him, I realized that Toby understands the school better than I do. He understands the people here better than anyone. I was so focused on forcing him to write answers on paper that I completely missed the fact that he was absorbing everything else. Mrs. Gable stared at him. She wasn't blinking. She was afraid to believe what she was hearing. So, does this mean? It means I tore up the transfer papers, Richard said firmly. I put them in the recycling bin down the hall. Toby is not going to the basement classroom. He is staying with Ms. Harmon. He is staying in the regular class. A sob escaped Mrs. Gable's throat. She quickly covered her mouth with her hand, nodding violently, unable to speak. She reached out and grabbed Toby's hand, squeezing it tight. But, Richard said, and Mrs. Gable flinched. We have to be realistic. I can't change the state curriculum overnight. Toby still has to learn to read and write. He still has to do math. The world demands those skills. We can't just ignore them. I know, Mrs. Gable said, wiping her eyes with a crumpled tissue. I know he has to work. I will help him. We will keep trying. No, Richard said, shaking his head. I don't want you to do it alone. This is a school. It's our job to figure this out, not just yours. We need to change how we teach him. If Toby has a gift for listening and for sound, then maybe that's the door we need to open to get to the rest of his mind. Richard looked at Toby. Toby, do you think you could learn your spelling words if we turned them into a song or if you recorded them on a tape recorder and listened to them? Toby's eyes lit up. He sat up straighter. I can remember anything if I hear it, he said clearly. The letters are hard to see, but the sounds are easy. Then that is what we will do, Richard said. I'm going to talk to the reading specialist. We're going to try audiobooks. We're going to try oral testing where you tell me the answer instead of writing it down. We are going to stop trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. It's going to take some work. It's going to be an experiment. I like experiments, Toby said with a small smile. Mrs. Gable laughed through her tears. It was a relieved, happy sound. So do I, Toby. Richard stood up. The tension in the room, the heavy gray cloud that had been hanging over them for weeks, had lifted. The air felt lighter, cleaner. He extended his hand toward Mrs. Gable. She stood up and took it. Her hand was rough from work, just like his. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," she whispered. "Thank you for listening." "No," Richard said, holding her hand for a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for fighting for him. You were right. He just needed a different way to speak." Mrs. Gable grabbed her purse, and she and Toby walked toward the door. Just as they reached it, Toby stopped. He let go of his mother's hand and turned back to look at the principal. "Mr. Vance," Toby asked. "Yes, Toby. Can I come back next month for the community share?" Richard smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "You can come back anytime you want, Toby. In fact, I think we might need you to teach us a few things." Toby grinned, a wide, toothy expression, before turning and running out the door to catch up with his mother. Richard stood alone in his office for a long time after they left. He walked over to the window and looked out at the playground. The sun was fully out now, casting a bright, hopeful light over the swings and the slides. He watched a group of children running, laughing, and shouting. He thought about the stack of files on his desk. He thought about the other students who might be struggling, whose numbers didn't add up, who were sitting in classrooms feeling stupid because the system didn't fit them. He realized that he had been doing his job, but he hadn't been doing his duty. His duty wasn't to produce data points, his duty was to protect the spirit of the children in his care. He walked back to his desk and sat down. He picked up his pen. He opened Toby's file. He crossed out the words learning disability and wrote in the margin, auditory gift. Differentiated instruction required. He picked up the phone and dialed the number for the district's special education coordinator, not to transfer Toby, but to ask for resources. He was going to fight for Toby now. He was going to fight with the same fire Mrs. Gable had shown in that chair 2 weeks ago. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be more meetings, more struggles, and days where the old doubts would creep back in. But for the first time in a long time, Principal Richard Vance felt like a true educator. He had learned a lesson from a 7-year-old boy. He had learned that every child has a voice, but not every voice sounds the same. And sometimes, you have to be very quiet, and very humble, to hear the ones that matter the most.